author is sometimes asked, how do you reconcile your commitment to psychological science with your commitment to Christian faith? Okay, so that's what this author has been asked. So let's break this down. How do they fit together? The author's answer, they fit together nicely. A humble faith in God and awareness of human fallibility motivates rigorous, open-minded science. Okay? Faith in God, realizing that we live in a fallen world, humans are fallible. Okay? Therefore, we need to try really hard to do good science. Okay? In fact, doing good science is an act of worshiping God, right? So I think God has given you the gift to do good science, right? Follow your research methods course, your scientific method. And if you do it poorly, you're not using your gifts well. But if God has given you the gift and you do it really well, you're praising God. So another question the author was asked, are they mutually supportive? The author answered, psychological science supports much biblical and theological wisdom. What I want to point out here is notice that biblical and theological wisdom is not supporting psychological science. Psychological science is doing the supporting. So you'll see this as a theme with levels of explanation. They tend to put psychology really before Christianity. And we'll see several examples of this. Whether viewed through the lens of ancient biblical wisdom or modern psychological science, the story of human nature is much the same. Another question the author has been asked, are there points of tension? The author's answer, the discoveries of psychological science do challenge some traditional Christian understanding. So notice that faith is reforming, not psychology. Psychology is challenging Christian understanding as opposed to Christian understanding challenging psychology. Okay. So I believe the Bible is God's truth. Therefore, I believe if psychology violates what Jesus said, what's in the Bible, then the psychology must be wrong. So that's more of a integrated perspective that we're going to talk about next week. But as you can see with levels of explanation, just focus on this. Christianity or biblical wisdom or the biblical worldview is being reformed, not psychology. Richard Dawkins sees faith as a mental virus and one of the world's greatest evils. He states the universe has no design, no purpose, no evil and good, nothing but blind, a pitiless indifference. So that's one perspective, but that's a very extreme perspective. And again, what the author is talking about here is that many secularists and Christians alike see science and faith as enemies. But again, we saw that, we didn't watch the video in this video, but I gave you the link for a TED Talk, and she discussed how many scientists are Christians and that they believe that there's a God. So they're at least theistic, not necessarily followers of Christ. Many of the founders of modern science were people whose religious convictions made them humble before nature and skeptical of human authority. The Christian convictions of Blaise Pascal, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and even Galileo led them to distrust human intuition and to explore God's creation and submit their ideas to testing. Okay. They viewed themselves in God's service, searching for truth in special revelation okay, which they called the book of God's word, and natural revelation, the book of God's work. Okay, so integrationists, we'll discuss this next week, also believe this point, but the Bible is the foundation. So that's the key. But again, so the book of God's works, okay, would be revelations that one gets through interacting with God's creation. And then the book of God's word is revelations one gets from interacting with the Bible. A disciplined, rigorous inquiry, checking our theories against reality, is part of what it means to love God with our minds. Integrationists would check their theories against the Bible. Levels of explanation folks keep the Bible and psychology separate. If God is the ultimate authority of whatever truth psychological science glimpses, then I can accept that truth, however surprising or unsettling. And again, the problem with thinking like this, right? If God is the ultimate author of whatever truth psychological science glimpses, well, isn't it possible that psychological science glimpses a truth that is not God's truth? So the levels of explanation folks, they would believe this statement. All truths are God's truths. So as we practice secular psychology, and there's research findings, which are fallible, by the way, they would say, well, this is God's truth. So essentially, this is really one of the weaknesses of levels of explanation. They uncritically accept all truths as God's truths. And that's just not the way it works. We know from a biblical worldview, we live in a fallen world. We live in a broken world. When Jesus teaches us how to pray, he tells us to pray that God's will is done and pray for protection from the evil one. So not all truths are God's truths, but they believe that they are. Openness to scientific inquiry becomes not just my right, but my religious duty. Again, this puts science before Christianity. That should say, which is consistent with the wording we have seen so far. Ready? Openness to scientific inquiry becomes not just my right, but my religious duty. I thought openness to biblical truths would be your religious duty, and understanding how those impact science. So let's take a look at, these are some foundational ideas of levels, but really, nuts and bolts wise, what is levels? They say each academic discipline provides a perspective from which we can study nature, okay, and our place in it. Which perspective is pertinent depends on what you want to talk about. So they say, let's take the example of romantic love. Okay, a physiologist would say it's a state of arousal. A social psychologist, so this would be like adrenaline, fight or flight sort of thing. A social psychologist would examine how various characteristics and conditions enhance the emotion of love. So for example, good looks, repeated exposure, similarity of partners, etc. A poet would express the sublime experience that love can sometimes be. A theologian, God-given goal of human relationships. So the idea here with levels of explanation, there's literally different levels of explaining different things. So in this case, the example is different levels of explaining what romantic love is. Try as it might, psychology cannot explain the purpose of human existence, the meaning of human life, the ultimate destiny of the human person. Psychological theories cannot account for this level of explanation. That's what the author's saying. Okay. So again, purpose of human existence, the meaning of human life, the ultimate destiny of the human person. So the author's saying psychology can't talk to us about that. Okay. But Christianity can. So they're different levels. Psychology is one important perspective from which we can view and understand ourselves, but it's not the only one. Okay. Faith connects to psychological science not only by motivating scientific inquiry and sensitizing us to implicit values, but as Table 1 indicates, in other ways as well. So we'll get into Table 1. Okay, so on its base level, what is it saying? So levels of explanation motivates us to do good science, right? Because like I was saying, by doing good science, you're praising God. Let's go back here for a second. So we talked about different levels. The levels of explanation, folks would say, do not integrate psychology and Christianity. Because if you integrate these different levels of explanation, you kind of confuse things, and it's unnecessary. These levels should be separate. So what are some strategies the author talks about for integrating psychology and Christianity? And again, you'll see it's not directly combining psychology and Christianity, okay? The author is discussing integrating psychology and Christianity, but leaving them in their separate levels. The first one is faith motivates us to understand God's creation and its truths, okay? So, for example, he talks about experiment on group polarization, okay? Exploring how group discussion changes and strengthens attitudes, reviewing studies of subjective well-being, for example, answering who is happy. So again, how are they integrated? Well, faith, or faith in God, motivates us to understand his creation. The second step here is the author's talking about faith mandates us to do science well. So we've already talked about this. Okay. His example, scrutinizing claims of the efficacy of intercessory prayer and faith healing, reporting tests of New Age claims of reincarnation, channeling, fortune telling, aura reading, telepathy, clairvoyance, astrology, and their implications of human godlike powers. 3, bringing psychology to Christian audiences. And this is interesting, right? So again, we see this bias in levels of explanation. Okay, they're not bringing their Christianity to psychological audiences. They're bringing their psychology to Christian audiences. So for example, writing for Christian and secular audiences. The fourth way the levels folk would talk about integrating psychology and Christianity is giving psychology to the church. So my question is, what about giving the church to psychology? So again, we see this bias here. So the author says, giving psychology to the church rather than giving the church to psychology. And his example, applying social influence and memory principles to the creation of memorable, persuasive sermons and effective evangelism. And in fact, you see this, the author's example here, I find it truly offensive. right? When we become Christians, right? Galatians, I think it's 2:20. I could be citing it wrong, but the verse says it's no longer us, but Christ who lives within us, right? So even right now, I'm leaning on Jesus Christ to get me through this lecture video, right? And I'm leaning on him to communicate to you through me what he needs you to hear. And that's Christianity. So this is actually quite offensive. Let's use some psychological tricks to influence the congregation. And the argument there would be like, no, we literally don't need that, because God will lead the pastor to say what the pastor needs to say to the congregation at that moment. That's the whole point. We're not trying to trick anyone or persuade them. The fifth point the author talks about, relating psychological research to Christian belief. So my question here, so again, relating psychological research to Christian belief. Okay, let's talk about them. But my question here is, but what if it is not congruent? Levels folks will say they are just different and drop the issue. Integrationists, which is next week, will have a different response. Okay? So relating psychological research to Christian belief, which is interesting that the author brings it up, because ultimately what would happen here from a levels of explanation standpoint, if psychology and Christianity disagree, they would just be like, okay, they're just different. They're different levels. That's why they disagree. Whereas an integrationist, which we'll talk about next week, their foundation is Christianity. Okay, so they practice psychology with that foundation. And if the psychological research, for example, or whatever method they're trying to use as a practitioner goes against the Bible, then they will say either my understanding of the Bible is incorrect or this psychology is incorrect. So again, you start to see different perspectives. The sixth point the author talks about, Christianity as a dependent variable. So for example, what predicts belief? Okay, independent variable, family history, personality characteristics, and trauma. Okay, so a dependent variable is a outcome variable. Okay, so what might this look like? So let's say Christianity is the DV, or the outcome variable. What literally predicts whether or not someone is Christian? Okay, so an independent variable could be, we'll just go with the first example, family history. So the groups would be people whose parents were Christian, okay? And the other group would be people whose parents were not Christian. And then we could see, okay, are people more likely to be Christians if their parents were Christians or if their parents were not Christians? And that's just one variable. But that's an example of using Christianity in secular psychological research, right? Basically just using it as a outcome variable in a study. Christianity as a independent variable. So an independent variable is what predicts the DV, the outcome variable. If someone is more Christian, are they happier than those who are less Christian? Do they have higher self-esteem than those who are less Christian? So, you know, what you could do, again, so your independent variable could be Christian. The groups could be yes, Christian. Another group could be no. Okay. And then you would measure them on happiness. So do Christians tend to be happier than non-Christians? Do Christians tend to have higher self-esteem or not than non-Christians?